Now, let's begin with efforts to regulate Nigeria's booming tech startup scene. The country is moving ever closer to passing into law the Nigeria Startup Bill. Supporters of the bill say the proposed new legislation will help transform the country's technology ecosystem, and the aim is to ensure that a supportive regulatory infrastructure is in place for startups across the country to make them more competitive and to create an enabling environment for them to thrive vis-a-vis other countries on the continent that are big on tech startups and digital transformation, including Tunisia, Kenya, and South Africa. With more on this and how transformative it's going to be, I'm joined now in the studio by Dr. Armstrong Takang, founder of River Hedge Partners Limited, a group that invests in technology startups in the Nigerian ecosystem. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
It's good to be here.
Tell us more about the startup bill and what it's set up to do.
Sure. Well, first of all, before we talk about that, it is important to understand the context of the startup ecosystem in Nigeria and the role that technology has come to play. Prior to now, we've had a lot of efforts to really catalyze the growth of the tech ecosystem, starting from when there was the plan to use technology to enable different sectors of the economy back in mid-2000, and then we moved to develop the Nigerian local content bill to actually help ensure that a lot of the value that is created in that ecosystem stays within the country. Because what was observed was that, yes, the GDP was experiencing a lot of contribution from the tech ecosystem, but a lot of that value was pretty much leaving the country because most of the key players that were involved were foreign companies. And so there was the deliberate effort to ensure that as much of the value that was being created locally would stay in Nigeria by putting in place that policy for local content development to encourage the use of local companies.
Right.
So this is perhaps a notch above that. Further, we're moving forward in terms of ensuring that we have a regulatory environment, we have a regulatory framework that would ensure that we have a lot more value captured within that ecosystem to encourage a lot of the participants locally to be there. So we're deliberate about it. So it's not about free fall. It's not about just leaving everything just happen on its own. We have to be deliberate about it. And I think that this bill is an attempt to ensure that we create an enabling environment that would enable a lot of the tech companies to do well, and the environment within which they operate becomes a lot more favorable. So we have a lot more competitive edge.
So it's basically a collaborative effort between the private sector and the policymakers within government, and it has the buy-in of stakeholders like yourself, does it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think what is beautiful about this particular piece of legislation is the fact that it really used an approach called Big Tent, which is multi-stakeholder. And the private sector has really been a key part of this in driving that legislation, ensuring that the content of the bill will reflect the needs and the priorities of the tech startup ecosystem. Of course, government is involved in it. You also have non-governmental organizations that are also involved in that process, and there were stakeholder engagements that brought together these different stakeholders to pretty much engage in ensuring that their views are heard, their voices are also heard, and then their input are also incorporated into the legislation.
And when we say that it's aimed at creating an enabling environment, that's become a bit of a cliche in Nigeria, that term, and that enabling environment is to help the sector grow. What exactly does this mean? How is it going to do that?
Excellent question. So just to put it into context, right? Even up to this point, we hear a lot of stories about successful Nigerian companies that have become unicorns. They raise a significant amount of money to the extent that the amount of money that is flowing, the capital that is flowing into that venture space has dwarfed foreign direct investment. We see that already, particularly this year. And there's a lot of excitement about that. But what is not actually said is that a lot of that capital is foreign capital. And a lot of the IP that backs up that capital is registered offshore. Which means that when these Nigerian tech startups experience a liquidity event, which means when there is an exit, when money is made, a lot of that money will not stay in Nigeria. a lot of that money would be outside, because most of the people who brought in that capital are
will
actually
take it out. Basically.
Precisely. Some of the money doesn't even come to Nigeria, even though the money is made in Nigeria by virtue of the products and services that are offered in Nigeria. So the first thing was to ensure that we domesticate as much of that liquidity event money in Nigeria. And that's not going to happen by accident. We need to be deliberate about it. And the legislation speaks to that in terms of making provision for capital, in terms of raising capital, enabling local investors participate in this investment process. And by so doing, when there is a liquidity event, when there is an exit, a lot of the proceeds from that would also stay locally, because a lot of the people that participated in that are there. But I think what is also
But Nigeria doesn't have a history of that, though. Even with local investors, they tend to want to spirit their money out.
Well, you know, it's interesting, right? There are different ways you have to look at this, right? It's not just about the money; it's about the impact, right? That these investments will make. Because if you look at all the major focus areas where there's been investment, whether you're talking about fintech, you're talking about edtech, agrotech, and now we're talking about infrastructure investments. Now, when a lot of capital flows into these subsectors, what happens is that these companies become successful. They employ local talents. They also grow that talent pool. We also have an experience base that actually attracts a lot more people to focus on Nigeria, as we are already seeing. If you look at the telecom space, for instance, today you have a large pool of experienced telecoms experts, primarily because a lot of those companies were established locally. And then you also have local investors that participated in it. I think we need to repeat the same thing in this tech ecosystem. Right.
And Nigeria, of course, has many startups, but it doesn't appear to be doing as well as both as countries like South Africa or Kenya, or I don't know, maybe it is, for instance, in terms of having an enabling environment and ease of doing business. How is this bill supposed to help in that regard?
Well, you know, contrary to that, you know, this is the reality. The reality is that if you look at the total amount of money that has flown into the continent this year so far, Nigeria actually is number one in terms of attracting the largest amount of capital into that venture space. So I think from that standpoint, we're doing well, right, in terms of being a magnet of that capital. Okay. If you also look at how much money is coming in, when you measure it against FDI that is coming in, the amount of money is significant, 4 or 5 times what is coming into FDI. So in terms of attracting that, there's already a pull towards that, better than those countries that you're mentioning. But I think what is important, is even more important, is the fact that we need to be a lot more deliberate about it. We need to be a lot more intentional about how we do it. We strongly believe that with a piece of legislation like this, if it is well implemented, we'll do even more than we're doing right now. And I think that's really one of the reasons for that.
And the fact, of course, is that it doesn't matter what Kenya or South Africa do, just the mere population size of Nigeria will always dwarf those countries, potentially, once we've got it right.
That is correct.
But what exactly is a startup for people out there who may not quite understand and are wondering, what is he talking about and talking about so well? I mean, it's pretty much tech-related companies, isn't it, such as Amazon, Uber, that sort of thing.
That is correct. Well, you know, startups typically, I mean, the best way to describe a startup is a small company that is leveraging on an idea, particularly tech startup, is a company that has been formed with a purpose to solve a problem using technology, right? And typically some of the attributes of a tech startup is these are companies that usually may not require a lot of money to start up, but a lot of it is around the idea, about the problem you're trying to solve. The second aspect of it is typically what happens is that the growth that they experience once they become successful is usually astronomically more than a traditional company that is growing. And that's why you see in a lot of investment processes recently, there's a lot more.
You're one of those investment processes,
right. Because if you look at how the return on investment, right, that you can get in terms of multiples, of what you invested in a tech startup once it is successful, it is several multiples more than what you will get if you invest in a traditional asset class. The other aspect of it that has to be briefly is around the people who are involved in it. You know, tech startups tend to be driven by young people who just have an idea, they have the passion, and they look for people to support them with resources as well as mentorship and management to help nurture and bring these ideas into fruition, solving key problems within society, but again, driven by technology.
Sounds absolutely fascinating. Please stay with us. We want to talk with you a little bit more. I mean, you're so articulate. We want to talk about it all day, basically. Well, you're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about tech startups in Nigeria and the effort that's underway to create a more enabling environment for a fully fledged digital transformation. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Anyagolu. Now, a massive effort is underway to properly regulate Nigeria's booming tech startup scene as the country moves closer to passing into law the Nigeria Startup Bill. Supporters say it'll transform the country's technology ecosystem, ensuring that a supportive regulatory infrastructure is in place for startups and placing Nigeria at the forefront of the African digital transformation race. But does it have the buy-in of all stakeholders, and is it able to get that unique mix of tech and business skills together, not to mention investment? And with me in the studio, Dr. Armstrong Takang, founder of River Hedge Partners Limited, the group that invests in technology startups in the Nigerian ecosystem. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. Why does it need such heavy regulation from the government when it's pretty much driven by private entities? I mean, in other words, why has it become necessary to regulate it at this stage? Is it just to create an enabling environment, the guidelines to maintain a certain standard, or what?
Very, great question. I think I just want to say something here. I think regardless of whatever we're going to say, the details of the bill, whether it is heavily focused on regulation or enablement, I think what is happening in Nigeria today are very exciting times. And we see that already. We see the number of tech startups in Nigeria. We see how much capital that space is attracting. We see the number of people who traditionally do not understand that sector wanting to be a part of it. We see it as a way out for a lot of young people who are coming out of school and looking for opportunities. They don't have jobs, but they can create their own businesses, and those businesses do not require a lot of capital to start. So long as you have the idea, it's innovation, you're solving a problem, and if the market is large enough, you can really become extremely successful. And we see this changing the economic landscape in Nigeria to the extent where traditional so-called rich people are going to see themselves trailing, where young people are going to take over from that. We're already seeing it already.
But give us an example of some of these startup businesses, because your company invests in them, the ones that you have found that you think are the types of businesses that one ought to invest in Nigeria, and how things like Twitter, for example, have affected those kinds of businesses.
Okay, so let's start with this. Let's look at specific subsectors where you find those companies. And of course, fintech, financial technology space, you've seen that already. We are aware of companies such as Paystack and Flutterwave and many others who are playing in that space. You can see the speed with which they became unicorn and the timeline within which they became unicorn, because they were solving a major problem, especially in terms of payment, enablement of payment services across, not only within Nigeria, but across the continent. And see the scale at which you can actually grow at that scale. And that makes it easier for them to attain growth rates as well as levels that traditional companies, brick and mortar companies can't, even banks can't. And also, so that's one. But you also have areas of intervention such as education technology, in terms of using technology to enable a lot of education services, to enable learning, to enable teaching. You have spaces around agriculture. How do you enable the different parts of the value chain of agriculture, whether it is in terms of the supply chain, in terms of actually being able to monitor the products within that space, or being able to bring together people that can invest in that space even without being farmers themselves. You also have areas around healthcare. We've seen a lot of tech companies, tech startups in the healthcare space, particularly after COVID came, because it was very clear that there are a lot of problems to be solved in that healthcare space as a result of issues such as COVID. And we're going to see a lot more of those activities there as the level of awareness increases, and then you also have issues around talents. But I want to say something. I think it'll be a disservice to this legislation and the effort if we focus too much on the aspect of regulation, because the legislation talks about capital.
Right.
Okay. How do we create a platform, create the right conditions to raise capital both domestically as well as internationally, and make those who are bringing that capital feel comfortable enough to even put more on the table. To even enable angel investors, as an example, smaller investors coming together as a group, as syndicates, to increase the pool of resources that are available for these startups to do that. And I see that every day, because when you talk to a lot of young people, you see that they have fantastic ideas, they have they make efforts, they are struggling. But by the time you add capital plus mentorship, you can see the level at which they can grow. I think what it also does is that it's also one of those opportunities that brings the older generation with the younger generation. The younger generation coming with the ideas, with the passion, but those who have a lot more experience coming with their capital, they come up with mentorship as well as the experience of having run businesses. And a combination of that is what is going to lead to something very significant. But let's talk about the regulation that you talked about. So long as it does not become too bureaucratic, there is a certain level of regulation that is required in a space like that. Because if you think about technology is very disruptive. And there are times when some of those solutions actually can create challenges in society and make people hesitant.
Right.
If you look at cyber crimes, for instance, a lot of that is being perpetrated using technology. And what that has done is that if it is not well managed, it makes those who might want to take who might want
That's
to
a
get
good
become hesitant. So people need to feel that there is some element of control, there is some element of regulation and protection for the consumers.
Absolutely.
In that
But
space.
what about the platforms that people use to conduct or carry out these businesses? Obviously, broadband, an essential tool.
That's part of the infrastructure.
Yeah, but also things like Twitter. We talked about Twitter. How has that hurt these businesses in Nigeria? The suspension of Twitter, for example.
Well, of course, it has, in the sense that a lot of the conversations that were going on, people use those platforms to articulate their views on certain issues, to raise awareness about certain issues. So, of course, when that is affected, it affects the extent to which those conversations can take place. It affects the extent to which businesses can advertise their products.
And people lose money, basically.
And people lose money, right? So I don't think there's any doubt as to whether or not that has affected
right. Okay.
the
Well,
ecosystem
we've got about
negatively.
3 minutes or so, and I want to talk a little bit about your firm,
Sure.
River Hedge Partners Limited, which you founded.
Sure.
It invests in technology startups in the Nigerian ecosystem, doesn't it? Tell us about that.
Okay. So effectively, from our perspective, a lot of us started in this field more than 20 years ago. We've run businesses, and we've seen how that space has evolved. And but right now, where we are, it is very clear that we need to be able to combine our experiences, the things we've done right, the things we didn't do so right, plus the fact that we have an advantage of capital, and combine that to help startups. For instance, we're investing in an ed tech company, but we're focused more on infrastructure. And the company, what we're doing here is to ensure that we're providing a platform that allows other entrepreneurs to run their businesses within the ecosystem of edtech. So effectively, you have a young person who is successful at what they do, but they now have an opportunity to teach others about what they do. And they have a large pool of students. So they can easily create their own school, if you like, where they can identify students who pay for their services and they teach them.
Right.
Whether it is in the music industry, it is in public speaking, it is in the healthcare, it is anything that you see as a hobby. You can actually make money by teaching others. And you might even find that the revenues from the teaching actually is more than what you do practicing.
That's very interesting.
Yeah,
so how do you rate the odds of startups succeeding? I understand that the long odds say that just 1 out of 10 startups succeed.
That is correct. The death rate in the startup ecosystem is very, very high.
Right.
Very many of them fail, right? But you see, there are ways and there are things you can do to reduce that death rate in that space. I think
and that's where people like you come in, I guess.
So one of them is clearly the fact that when you have organized system where you have a lot more mentors, people who have experiences to coach and mentor a lot of those young entrepreneurs to avoid the mistakes that we may have made, I think that helps as well. Because what you find sometimes is not enough to be able to code. It's not enough to have an idea. You need to be able to put that together as a business.
Right.
And the tenets and the principles
And that's
of
the
every
key,
business.
isn't it?
Absolutely.
So is it a form of Russian roulette then? I mean, the sort of thing, and is it the sort of thing that developing countries should be playing with?
I think so. I think so. It's the interesting thing about the tech ecosystem is is a leveler, right? It's a disruptor, to the extent that the fact that today your company is making $1 billion in revenues, if a tech startup comes in there and becomes a disruptor,
right,
you could be trailing in that same space, and that's an area where we have an advantage.
Dr. Armstrong Takang, always a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you very much indeed. Very enlightening, this chat.
You're welcome.